Captain Jake Morrison stared at the blue hologram floating above his command desk and felt his heart skip a beat. The message had arrived 3 hours ago through channels humanity had never used before. It carried the official seal of something, called the Galactic Council, and contained words that would change everything. Humanity is invited to present itself for evaluation and potential membership in the galactic community. The message began in perfect English. Jake read it for the 5th time and still could not believe it. After 40 years of sending signals into space and getting nothing back, the aliens had finally answered. Dr. Linda Hayes knocked on his door and entered without waiting for permission. She carried a tablet full of data and wore the excited expression Jake had seen whenever she discovered something new in her lab. "Captain, I have been studying the transmission data," she said, settling into the chair across from his desk. "This is not some random contact. They know everything about us." Jake raised an eyebrow and gestured for her to continue. Linda swiped through screens of analysis data and pulled up a list that made his stomach drop. "They know our population numbers, our technological level, our military capabilities, even our political structures. Someone has been watching us for a very long time." The implications hit Jake like a physical blow. If aliens had been observing Earth for decades without making contact, there had to be a reason they were reaching out now. Either humanity had finally reached some threshold that made them worth noticing, or something had changed in the galaxy that made human contact necessary. Communications Officer Ryan Clark appeared in the doorway, looking pale. "Captain, you need to hear this," he said, connecting his headset to the room's audio system. Static filled the air for a moment before alien voices became clear. The translation software struggled with some words, but the meaning was obvious. "The humans barely qualify for consideration," said one voice with a tone that sounded dismissive. "Their ships are primitive and their weapons are laughable. This will be over quickly." Another voice responded with what sounded like amusement. "I heard they show their teeth when greeting others. How wonderfully savage. Perhaps we can study their aggression patterns before they are eliminated." A third voice joined the conversation. "The betting pools give them less than one standard. Cycle before they withdraw their application. No species that young has ever passed the trials." Ryan cut the audio feed and looked at Jake with worry in his eyes. "There are dozens of these conversations, Captain. They are all saying the same thing. We are walking into some kind of test that we are expected to fail." Jake stood and walked to the viewing port where stars moved slowly past the ship. The New Horizon was humanity's most advanced vessel, built specifically for this moment. It carried their best and brightest, people who had trained their entire lives for first contact. Yet, according to these aliens, they were children playing at being adults. "How long until we reach this Kepler Prime station?" Jake asked without turning around. 18 hours, Ryan replied. "But Captain, maybe we should reconsider. If they expect us to fail, maybe there is something we do not understand about what we are walking into." Linda stood and moved beside Jake at the viewing port. "Or maybe that is exactly why we need to go," she said quietly. "If every other species has been following the same pattern for thousands of years, perhaps what they see as our weakness might actually be our strength." Jake thought about the recordings of alien conversations and the dismissive way they spoke about humanity. These beings had achieved faster than light travel, built stations in space, and created a galactic civilization. Yet something in their voices suggested they were not as confident as they wanted to appear. "Assemble the senior staff," Jake said, turning back to face his officers. "I want everyone to understand what we are facing. If these aliens think they can predict how we will respond to their challenges, then we need to show them just how wrong they can be." As Linda and Ryan left to gather the crew, Jake remained at the viewing port and smiled. It was not a pleasant smile or a diplomatic one. It was the smile of someone who had just realized that being underestimated might be the greatest advantage humanity could ask for. The ship continued its journey toward Kepler Prime, carrying 43 humans into a situation none of them fully understood. Behind them, Earth waited for news of first contact. Ahead of them, an ancient galactic community prepared to judge whether humanity deserved a place among the stars. None of the aliens betting against humanity had considered one simple fact. Humans had spent their entire evolutionary history as the underdog, facing impossible odds and finding ways to survive. They had climbed out of caves, crossed oceans, and reached for the stars despite every obstacle the universe placed in their path. Now they were about to discover that some things never change, no matter how far from home you travel. The universe was still full of challenges that seemed impossible to overcome. The only difference was that this time, the stakes were higher than they had ever been before. Ambassador Carol Bennett walked into the diplomatic chambers of Kepler Prime and immediately felt every alien eye in the room focus on her. The station was massive, easily 10 times larger than anything humanity had ever built, with corridors that stretched for kilometers and gravity fields that shifted depending on which species designed each section. The chamber itself was a perfect circle with raised platforms for each delegation. The Vorthak Empire occupied the highest platform, their representatives standing nearly 3 meters tall with dark scales and eyes that glowed red in the dim lighting. Their military bearing was obvious in every movement they made. To their left sat the Zephyrian Collective, beings of pale blue skin and oversized heads that pulsed with visible brain activity. They wore robes covered in symbols that seemed to shift and change as Carol watched them. Everything about them suggested advanced intelligence and cold logic. The Quillen Federation filled the third major platform with beings that looked almost like walking plants, their green skin covered in patterns that reminded Carol of currency symbols. They moved with calculated precision and spoke in whispers that sounded like mathematical equations. The human platform was the smallest and positioned lower than the others. Carol could hear alien conversations flowing around the room. Most of them discussing humanity as if they were not present. The translation devices made every word clear. "Look how they expose their teeth," said a Vorthak officer to his companion. "Such aggressive displays from a species that claims to seek peace." A Zephyrian scholar adjusted her robes and spoke to her aide. "Their emotional responses are completely uncontrolled. Notice how their facial expressions change constantly. How do they make logical decisions with such unstable mental states?" Ben Carter stepped up beside Carol and smiled at the aliens staring at them. Several Vorthak immediately reached for their weapons before remembering they were in a diplomatic zone. The reaction made Ben's smile grow wider, which only increased the tension in the room. "They really do not like it when we do that," he whispered to Carol. The testing began with a simple announcement from the chamber's central AI. Each delegation would face a crisis simulation involving a star system on the verge of collapse. They had 6 hours to present their solution to a panel of judges from all 3 major species. The scenario was brutal in its simplicity. A system of 5 inhabited worlds was experiencing resource depletion, civil war, and environmental collapse. Previous galactic interventions had failed, and the situation was deteriorating rapidly. Each species had to propose a comprehensive solution. The Vorthak went first. Commander Thex stood on his platform and presented their plan with military precision. "Overwhelming force applied strategically," he announced. "Deploy battle fleets to each world, eliminate resistance leaders, and establish military governance. Resource allocation will be determined by productivity quotas. Estimated timeline for stability, 18 months. The Quillen representative followed with an economic approach. Debt restructuring and resource monopolization, they explained in their mathematical tone. Provide emergency aid in exchange for exclusive trading rights. Establish Quillen-controlled resource extraction facilities. Projected profit margins will fund continued stability operations. Scholar Vex II of the Zephyrians presented last among the major powers. Technological intervention with behavioral modification, she stated. Deploy advanced weather control systems and agricultural enhancement. Implement neural adjustment protocols to reduce aggressive tendencies in the population. Logical decision making will replace emotional responses. When Ben Carter stood to present humanity's solution, the chamber fell silent. Every alien present had seen variations of the same three approaches for thousands of years. Military dominance, economic control, or technological superiority were the only logical responses to such a crisis. We propose something different, Ben began, his voice carrying clearly through the chamber. Instead of imposing our will on these worlds, we suggest empowering them to save themselves. A ripple of confusion moved through the alien delegates. Several Vorthak exchanged glances while the Zephyrians began rapid calculations on their devices. Ben continued without acknowledging the disruption. Our plan has 3 phases. First, we provide immediate humanitarian aid with no strings attached. Food, medical supplies, and temporary shelter for refugees. Second, we offer technical advisors who will work with local leaders to identify sustainable solutions that fit their cultural values. Third, we establish trade partnerships that benefit everyone involved, not just the intervening power. Commander Thex stood up on his platform and pointed one clawed finger at Ben. This is not a solution, it is wishful thinking. These worlds are dying because their inhabitants are weak and disorganized. Only strong leadership can save them. The Quillen representative made a sound like rustling leaves that translated as laughter. Economic inefficiency at its worst, resources expended, with no guaranteed return on investment. Such thinking leads to bankruptcy and collapse. Scholar Vexi tilted her oversized head and studied Ben with obvious puzzlement. Your approach ignores fundamental logical principles. Beings in crisis require guidance from superior intellects. Allowing them to make decisions based on emotion and tradition will only accelerate their destruction. Ben looked around the chamber and smiled again. This time, the expression reached his eyes and seemed to contain something the aliens could not identify. It was not aggression or dominance or calculated superiority. It was something else entirely. Maybe that is exactly the point, Ben said quietly. You all assume that strength means control and success means dominance. But what if the real strength comes from helping others find their own way forward? The chamber erupted in alien voices, all speaking at once. The judges called for order while delegates from minor species watched the humans with expressions that ranged from confusion to something that might have been hope. Lieutenant Amy Rodriguez sat in the back of the human delegation and took careful notes on every alien reaction. She had studied xenobiology for 15 years and had never seen anything like the fear responses she was witnessing. Heart rates elevated, stress hormones flooding their systems, defensive postures activated. They were not just disagreeing with humanity's approach. They were terrified by it. As the session ended and delegates filed out of the chamber, Amy heard whispered conversations in dozens of languages. The translation software caught fragments that painted a disturbing picture. Unpredictable behavioral patterns. Cannot calculate proper responses. Threat assessment impossible. They smile when they should snarl. Amy realized that humanity had stumbled into something much larger than a simple membership test. They had challenged the fundamental assumptions that held galactic civilization together, and the established powers were beginning to understand just how dangerous that challenge might be. Paul Davis walked through the merchant quarter of Kepler Prime and watched something that made his stomach turn. A Quillen trader was negotiating with representatives from a small species called the Keth, beings that looked like furry bipedal, creatures with large eyes full of desperation. The Keth delegation was trying to buy food supplies for their homeworld, which was experiencing crop failures. The Quillen merchant quoted prices that were clearly impossible for them to pay, then offered a contract that would give the Quillen Federation mining rights to their entire planet in exchange for 6 months of food aid. Standard galactic commerce. Rates, the Quillen explained in their mathematical tone. Resource extraction agreements are common practice for species experiencing economic difficulties. Paul stepped forward before he could stop himself. "Excuse me," he said, causing both groups to look at him with surprise. "I could not help but overhear your negotiation. Perhaps there is a better solution." The Quillen trader made a sound like rustling paper that translated as irritation. "Human interference is not welcome in established commercial relationships." Paul ignored the trader and addressed the Keth directly. "What type of crop failures are you experiencing?" he asked. "Maybe the problem can be solved without giving up your mining rights." The lead Keth representative looked confused by the question. "Our soil has become too acidic for traditional crops. The Quillen Federation offered to provide alkaline treatments, but the cost was beyond our ability to pay." Paul smiled and pulled out his portable computer. "Alkaline treatments are actually very simple to produce. Most planets have the necessary materials already available. Would you like me to show you how to make them yourselves?" The Quillen trader stepped between Paul and the Keth delegation. "Commercial information sharing without proper licensing fees violates galactic trade regulations." "I am not sharing commercial information," Paul replied, his smile never wavering. "I am sharing basic chemistry that any species should have access to. Knowledge should not be something you can own." Within an hour, Paul had shown the Keth how to extract alkaline compounds from their own mineral deposits and create soil treatments that would restore their agricultural productivity. The solution cost them almost nothing and required no outside intervention. The Keth left the station with genuine smiles on their furry faces, while the Quillen trader stared at Paul with what could only be described as horror. Meanwhile, Dr. Linda Hayes was discovering something equally disturbing in the station's public archives. She had requested access to historical records about galactic civilization and found patterns that troubled her deeply. Every species that had joined the galactic community followed the same basic progression. They started as explorers and innovators, full of curiosity and creativity. Within a few generations of galactic contact, they became rigid and predictable, locked into one of 3 basic behavioral patterns: military dominance, economic exploitation, or technological superiority. The archives contained detailed psychological profiles of dozens of species. Each one showed the same transformation from dynamic, unpredictable cultures to static, controlled societies that fit neatly into the galactic power structure. "They are not just testing us for membership," Linda whispered to herself as she read through case study after case study. "They are testing us to see if we can be controlled." Lisa Morgan was having her own revelations in the station's recreational areas. She had attempted to engage various aliens in casual conversation, hoping to build informal relationships that might help during the formal testing. Every conversation followed the same pattern. When she smiled and tried to share stories about human culture, the aliens became visibly uncomfortable. When she laughed at something they said, they interpreted it as mockery or aggression. When she offered to help with small problems they reacted with suspicion and fear. A young Vorthak officer had been struggling with a malfunctioning data pad. Lisa offered to take a look, since human technology used similar principles. Within minutes, she had identified and fixed the problem. Instead of gratitude, the Vorthak officer stepped back and reached for his weapon. "Human deception tactics will not work on trained military personnel," he said, his voice full of tension. "I was just trying to help," Lisa replied, genuinely confused by his reaction. "Help is a form of weakness manipulation," the officer responded. "You create artificial debt relationships to gain advantage over your targets." Lisa stared at him with growing understanding. These aliens did not have concepts like altruism or compassion for strangers. Every action had to have a calculated benefit. Every relationship had to serve a purpose. The idea of helping someone simply because they needed help was completely foreign to their thinking. Captain Jake Morrison gathered his senior staff in their assigned quarters and listened to their reports with growing concern. What they were describing was not just a different culture or alien mindset, it was something much more fundamental. They have eliminated unpredictability from their entire civilization, Dr. Hayes concluded. Every species, every individual, every response follows predetermined patterns. They know exactly how everyone will react to any given situation, which explains why they are so afraid of us, Paul added. We do not fit their patterns. They cannot predict what we will do next. Amy Rodriguez pulled up her behavioral analysis, data on the room's display screen. Look at these stress response measurements from today's interactions. Every time one of us smiled or offered help or suggested an alternative solution, their biological systems went into crisis mode. They are not just testing us, Jake said slowly. They are trying to figure out if we are a threat to their entire way of life. Ryan Clark had been monitoring alien communications throughout the day. Captain, I think you need to hear this, he said, activating his recording equipment. Voices filled the room, speaking in various alien languages. The translation software worked through the conversations, revealing fragments that painted a terrifying picture. Behavioral analysis remains inconclusive. Human responses do not match any known patterns. Threat level cannot be calculated. They smile when facing danger instead of showing appropriate fear. Recommendation: immediate termination of contact. Protocols. The room fell silent as the implications became clear. Humanity was not just failing some test for galactic membership. They were being evaluated as a potential threat to the stability of galactic civilization itself. Jake stood and walked to the window where alien ships moved through space in perfectly ordered patterns. Everything about this place spoke of control, and predictability taken to an extreme that eliminated any possibility of growth or change. They have created a galaxy where nothing unexpected can happen, he said quietly, where every species follows the same basic rules and every individual knows their exact place in the hierarchy, and we just showed up and started breaking all their rules, Lisa added with a smile that would have terrified any alien who saw it. Jake turned back to his crew and felt something he had not experienced since childhood. It was the feeling of being completely out of his depth, facing something so much larger and more powerful than himself that victory seemed impossible. It was also the feeling that made him smile. The final challenge arrived with all the ceremony the aliens could manage. Danny Shaw stood beside Karen Foster in the main diplomatic hall as hundreds of alien observers filled the viewing galleries. This was no longer just a test for humanity. It had become the most watched event in recent galactic history. The crisis was real, not simulated. Two species called the Nexari and the Veltar were on the verge of war over disputed territory in the Outer Rim. Both sides had requested galactic intervention, which meant the established powers would choose a winner and enforce their decision through overwhelming force. The human delegation will serve as arbitrators, announced the chief judge, an ancient Zephyrian whose head pulsed with calculations. Standard protocols apply. Examine the evidence, select the stronger claim, and authorize enforcement action. Time limit: 6 standard hours. Karen reviewed the case files while Danny analyzed the military situation. On the surface, it appeared straightforward. The Nexari claimed the disputed worlds based on ancient territorial rights. The Veltar claimed them based on current resource needs and population pressure. Both sides presented compelling legal arguments. The established galactic powers had already made their positions clear. The Vorthak supported the Nexari because they had stronger military traditions. The Zephyrians favored the Veltar because their claim was more logically structured. The Quillins wanted whoever could pay the highest enforcement fees. This is exactly how they want us to think, Karen said quietly as she studied the data. Pick a side, impose our will, and maintain the status quo. But look at this underlying information. Danny leaned over her shoulder and saw what she meant. Buried in the economic data was evidence of systematic resource extraction by Quillin companies on both species' homeworlds. The territorial dispute was not about ancient rights or population pressure. It was about desperation. Both species were being slowly drained of their natural resources through unfair trade agreements. The disputed worlds represented their last chance for economic survival, which meant they were fighting each other instead of addressing the real problem. The Quillins are playing them against each other, Danny realized. While they fight over 3 worlds, Quillin corporations are strip-mining their original territories. Karen pulled up historical data and found the same pattern repeated dozens of times throughout galactic history. Minor species would be maneuvered into conflicts with each other while the major powers extracted profit from both sides. The arbitration process was designed to formalize the theft and make it seem legitimate. "We are not going to pick a side," Karen announced to the watching aliens. "We are going to solve the real problem." The chamber erupted in confused alien voices. Commander Thex of the Vorthax stood on his platform and pointed one massive claw at the human delegation. "That is not how arbitration works. You must choose between the competing claims and authorize enforcement action." "Why?" Danny asked simply. The question seemed to break something in the aliens' thinking. They stared at him with expressions ranging from confusion to panic. Several Zephyrians began rapid calculations while Quillin representatives whispered frantically among themselves. "Because that is the established procedure," Scholar Vexi finally replied. "Galactic law requires a definitive resolution to territorial disputes." "Galactic law requires justice," Karen corrected. "And justice means addressing the actual cause of this conflict, not just picking a winner." She activated the chamber's main display and showed evidence of Quillin resource extraction on both species' homeworlds. The data painted a clear picture of systematic exploitation designed to create exactly this kind of desperate conflict. "The Nexari and Veltar are not fighting over territory," Karen explained to the shocked chamber. "They are fighting for survival because their resources have been stolen through predatory trade agreements. Give them back what was taken, and the territorial dispute becomes irrelevant." The Quillin ambassador rose from his platform with movements that suggested barely controlled panic. "These are legitimate commercial arrangements. Resource extraction rights were obtained through proper legal channels. Legal channels that you designed to be impossible to understand or escape," Danny replied. "We have analyzed the contracts. They are deliberately written to trap developing species in permanent debt relationships." The chamber fell silent except for the sound of alien breathing systems working overtime. Heart rate monitors on various species showed stress levels approaching dangerous thresholds. Captain Jake Morrison chose that moment to stand and address the entire assembly. The smile that spread across his face was unlike anything the aliens had ever seen. It was not aggressive or threatening or diplomatic. It was the smile of someone who had just realized that the game was rigged and was genuinely delighted by the challenge that represented. "You really thought we would just pick a side and move on," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the chamber. "You expected us to follow your rules and maintain your system and become another predictable piece in your carefully controlled galaxy?" He gestured toward Karen and Danny, both of whom were smiling now with the same unsettling expression. "But that is not what humans do. When we see injustice, we do not just accept it as the natural order. When we see people suffering, we do not calculate whether helping them serves our interests. When we see a system that creates conflict and misery, we do not just work within that system, we change it." Commander Thex activated his platform's emergency protocols and spoke directly to his homeworld. "Priority alert to Vorthak High Command. Human behavioral patterns represent immediate threat to galactic stability. Recommend activation of containment protocols. Similar messages were being sent by every major power in the chamber. The humans had not just refused to follow established procedures, they had exposed the fundamental corruption that kept the galaxy stable and predictable. Tony Blake monitored the alien communications from his position in the observation area and realized the full scope of what humanity had stumbled into. The three major species were not just competitors for galactic dominance, they were partners in a system designed to prevent exactly what humans represented: genuine change. They have been working together for millennia, he whispered into his communication device. Military force, economic control, and technological superiority. Three different methods of maintaining the same basic system. They compete with each other, but they all benefit from keeping everyone else predictable and controlled. The Nexari and Veltar representatives were staring at the evidence on the main display with expressions that suggested their entire world view was crumbling. They had been so focused on their territorial dispute that they had never questioned why they were fighting in the first place. "You are saying our conflict was artificially created?" the Nexari leader asked in a voice full of growing anger. "We are saying your conflict was manufactured to keep you distracted while your resources were stolen," Karen replied. "And you are not the first species this has happened to." The chamber's emergency lighting activated as alien security forces surrounded the human delegation. The established powers had made their decision. Humanity represented a threat that could not be contained through normal procedures. By authority of the Galactic Council, the human delegation is hereby detained pending further evaluation, announced the chief judge. Charges include violation of arbitration protocols, dissemination of classified information, and incitement to interspecies discord. Jake's smile never wavered as the alien guards approached. "Classified information," he repeated. "Is that what you call evidence of systematic exploitation and manufactured conflicts?" He looked around the chamber at hundreds of alien faces, most showing fear or confusion or rage. But scattered among the major power representatives, he saw something else. Minor species delegates were looking at the humans with expressions that suggested hope was not entirely dead in this galaxy. "You can detain us," Jake said as the guards placed restraints on his wrists. "You can charge us with whatever crimes you want, but you cannot stop what we have already started. Because now, everyone knows the truth about how your perfect system really works." As the humans were led from the chamber, the galaxy's carefully maintained order began to crack. And somewhere in the depths of space, other species that had been watching the proceedings began to ask questions they had never dared ask before. Rachel Green sat in the detention cell and listened to alien communications through equipment she had hidden in her clothing before the arrest. What she heard made her blood run cold. The three major powers were not just angry about humanity's interference. They were planning something that would eliminate the human threat permanently. "Emergency session of the Inner Council has reached consensus," transmitted a Vorthak military commander. "Human behavioral patterns represent existential threat to galactic stability. Recommend immediate implementation of Protocol 7, Rachel." Had studied galactic law extensively and knew that Protocol 7 was the complete destruction authorization. It had only been used 3 times in recorded galactic history, each time against species that had somehow threatened the established order. In the cell beside her, Steve Park was treating Karen Foster for injuries she had received during their arrest. The aliens had not been gentle when the humans refused to cooperate with interrogation procedures. They could not understand why the humans would not simply accept punishment and move on. "They keep asking us to explain our motivations," Karen said through swollen lips. "They cannot comprehend why we would risk everything to help strangers." Captain Jake Morrison sat against the far wall with that same unsettling smile still on his face. Even in detention, even facing what might be execution, he seemed genuinely amused by their situation. "Let me guess," he said to Rachel. "They are calling an emergency session to decide our fate." "Worse than that," Rachel replied, sharing her intercepts with the group. "They are treating us like a plague that needs to be eliminated before it spreads." The evidence was overwhelming. Coded transmissions between the three major powers revealed the truth about galactic civilization. They were not competitors at all. They were partners in a carefully orchestrated system designed to prevent exactly what humanity represented. Thus, Vorthak provided military enforcement. The Zephyrians provided technological control. The Quillans provided economic manipulation. Together, they had created a galaxy where every species followed predictable patterns and every conflict served their interests. "We stumbled into something that took them millions of years to build," Danny Shaw said from his position near the cell door. "A perfect system for controlling entire civilizations without them even realizing they are being controlled. And now, they have to decide whether to let us live and risk everything they have built or destroy us and maintain their perfect order," Paul Davis added. The answer came sooner than expected. Commander Vax of the Vorthak appeared outside their cell with a full military escort. His expression suggested he was about to do something that disgusted him, but which necessity demanded. "The Galactic Council has reached a decision regarding humanity," he announced in a voice devoid of emotion. "You will be offered one final choice. Submit to behavioral conditioning that will make your responses predictable and controllable, or face total war against the combined forces of galactic civilization." Jake stood and walked to the cell barrier, his smile growing wider as he faced the alien commander. "Behavioral conditioning? You mean you want to lobotomize us?" "We want to civilize you," Vax replied. "Every species that joins galactic society undergoes psychological adjustment to eliminate unpredictable behavior patterns. It is a simple procedure that removes emotional instability and irrational thinking. It removes everything that makes us human," Lisa Morgan said from the back of the cell. Vax turned his attention to her with something that might have been sympathy. "It removes chaos and replaces it with order. You will still be yourselves, but better. More logical, more predictable, more useful to galactic society." The implications were staggering. Every species in the galaxy had been systematically altered to fit into predetermined behavioral patterns. The diversity and creativity that should have flourished among the stars had been surgically removed and replaced with controlled compliance. "How many species have you done this to?" Dr. Linda Hayes asked. "All of them," Vax replied simply. "It is the price of admission to galactic civilization. Chaos must be eliminated for order to flourish." Amy Rodriguez pulled up memories of every alien she had interacted with since arriving at Kepler Prime. The rigid thinking patterns, the inability to understand concepts like compassion or humor, the terror they showed when faced with unpredictable human behavior. It all made sense now. "You have turned the entire galaxy into robots," she said with growing horror. "We have turned the galaxy into a stable, peaceful, productive society," Scholar Vexai corrected as she joined Vax outside the cell. "War is eliminated when everyone follows logical behavioral patterns. Suffering is reduced when emotional responses are controlled. Progress is achieved when all effort is directed toward predetermined goals." "That is not progress," Jake said, his smile finally fading. "That is death. You have killed the soul of every species in this galaxy." Vexai tilted her oversized head and studied Jake with genuine curiosity. "Soul is an emotional concept with no logical basis. We have eliminated suffering and created perfect order. Why do you resist improvement? Because improvement that comes at the cost of everything that makes us who we are is not improvement at all," Jake replied. "It is surrender." The aliens exchanged glances that suggested they were communicating through methods the humans could not detect. When they finished, Vax stepped closer to the cell barrier. "You have 1 hour to decide," he announced. "Submit to behavioral conditioning and take your place in galactic civilization, or we will eliminate humanity as a threat to galactic stability." "All of humanity?" Karen asked. "Not just us." "Your home world will be sterilized," Vax confirmed without emotion. "Your colonies will be destroyed. Your ships will be hunted down and eliminated. We cannot allow chaos to spread through the galaxy." As the aliens left, the humans sat in their cell and contemplated the choice they had been given. Submit to mental slavery or face genocide. It was the kind of impossible decision that had no good answers. "There is a third option," Jake said quietly after several minutes of silence. The others looked at him with expressions ranging from hope to desperation. "We refuse both choices and find our own way forward," he continued. "We show them that unpredictability is not chaos. It is the source of all growth, all creativity, all hope for something better than what exists now." "Against the combined military might of 3 galactic empires?" Ben Carter asked. Jake's smile returned, but this time it was different. It was not the smile of someone facing impossible odds. It was the smile of someone who had just realized that impossible odds were exactly where humans did their best work. "Do you remember what Paul told those Keth merchants?" Jake asked. "Knowledge should not be something you can own." Well, neither should freedom. And it is time the galaxy remembered what freedom actually means. Outside their cell, alien guards reported to their commanders that the humans were displaying inappropriate emotional responses to their situation. Instead of showing proper fear or logical acceptance of their circumstances, they appeared to be planning something. The guards could not explain why this was so disturbing. They only knew that when humans smiled like that, something unpredictable was about to happen. And in a galaxy built on perfect predictability, unpredictability was the most terrifying force imaginable. Nicole Reed received the transmission from Kepler Prime just as her squadron was completing patrol duties near the outer colonies. The message was brief and encrypted, but its meaning was clear. Humanity had 1 hour before the galaxy's 3. Major powers launched a coordinated attack on every human settlement in known space. "All ships, this is Commander Reed," she broadcast on emergency frequencies. "We have a code black scenario. Hostile forces are moving against all human colonies." Simultaneously. "This is not a drill." The response was immediate. Every human ship within communication range began transmitting acknowledgement signals. Cargo haulers, exploration vessels, mining platforms, even civilian transports started moving toward predetermined rally points. What the aliens had not anticipated was that humanity had spent the past 40 years preparing for exactly this scenario. Every human settlement had emergency protocols. Every ship carried weapons and shields far beyond what their specifications suggested. Every crew had trained for the possibility that first contact might go very badly. On Kepler Prime, Jake Morrison sat in his detention cell and listened to the sounds of alien military preparations. Massive ships were moving into position around the station. Communication arrays were buzzing with encrypted traffic. The galaxy's most powerful civilizations were mobilizing for war against a species they had known about for less than a week. "They really are going to try to wipe us out," Paul Davis said as explosions echoed through the station's hull. "Of course they are," Jake replied with that unsettling smile still on his face. "We represent everything they fear most: change, growth, unpredictability, hope for something better than what exists now." Ryan Clark was monitoring alien communications through his hidden equipment when something unexpected happened. The signals started changing. Instead of military coordination, he was hearing confusion and panic. "Captain, you need to hear this," he said, activating his speakers. Alien voices filled the cell, speaking in dozens of languages as the translation software struggled to keep up. Human vessels appearing throughout Sector 7. Defensive positions compromised by unknown tactical approaches. They are not fighting the way our simulations predicted. Repeat, human combat doctrines do not match any known military patterns. Through his communication gear, Jake could hear Nicole Reed's voice coordinating the human response. Remember, our goal is not conquest. We are here to liberate, not destroy. Disable their weapons, protect civilian populations, and show them there is another way. The alien military commanders had expected humanity to respond with either desperate defense or overwhelming offense. Instead, they were witnessing something that had never happened in galactic history. The humans were fighting a war designed to free their enemies rather than defeat them. Human ships appeared throughout the galaxy with timing so precise it suggested coordination that should have been impossible for such a young species. They attacked military installations while protecting civilian areas. They disabled weapon systems while leaving life support intact. They broadcast messages of hope to oppressed populations while offering protection to anyone who wanted it. Most disturbing of all, they kept smiling. Commander Thex watched his battle fleet being systematically dismantled by human forces that seemed to anticipate his every move. "This is impossible," he transmitted to Vorthak High Command. "They are using tactics that should not work against superior numbers and technology." The response from his superiors carried a note of panic that Thex had never heard before. All conventional military doctrine assumes opponents will follow logical, behavioral patterns. Humans appear to prioritize enemy welfare over tactical advantage, recalculate strategies immediately, but there was no time to recalculate. Human forces were already moving on to the next phase of their impossible plan. Instead of pressing their advantage through military conquest, they were doing something even more dangerous. They were offering hope to every oppressed species in the galaxy. On a dozen worlds throughout Quillen space, human ships appeared in orbit and began broadcasting the same message. The Quillen Federation has been stealing your resources through illegal contracts. We have evidence of systematic exploitation spanning centuries. You do not have to accept this anymore. The response was immediate. Species that had submitted to economic slavery for generations suddenly realized they had alternatives. Mining worlds stopped production. Agricultural planets ceased food shipments. Entire sectors of the galactic economy ground to a halt as oppressed populations chose freedom over security. In Zephyrian territory, human technicians were broadcasting different messages. Your government has been altering your brain chemistry to eliminate emotional responses and creative thinking. We can show you how to reverse the process. You can choose to think for yourselves again. The psychological conditioning that had kept Zephyrian society stable for millennia began to crumble as individuals remembered what it felt like to feel hope, to dream of something better, to imagine possibilities beyond their predetermined roles. Scholar Vex-I received reports from throughout Zephyrian space and felt something she had not experienced since her conditioning. It was an emotion the humans called fear, and it was terrifying in its intensity. Emergency session of the Science Council, she transmitted to her homeworld. Human influence is causing systematic breakdown of social conditioning protocols. Citizens are displaying unpredictable behavioral patterns. Recommend immediate implementation of neural reset procedures. But even as she spoke, Vex-I found herself wondering what it would be like to experience emotions without artificial constraints. The thought was so alien to her conditioned mind that it caused physical pain, but she could not stop thinking about it. On Kepler Prime, the detention facility was in chaos. Minor species delegates were demanding answers about the evidence the humans had revealed. Quillen representatives were trying to maintain control while their economic empire collapsed around them. Vorthak officers were receiving contradictory Orders from a military command structure that had never faced an enemy like humanity. Jake Morrison stood at his cell door and watched alien security forces running through the corridors in obvious panic. "I think our hour is up," he said to his crew. "And I think we just changed the galaxy forever," Amy Rodriguez replied, monitoring the communications traffic that filled every frequency. The war lasted exactly 18 hours. It ended not because one side defeated the other, but because the fundamental assumptions that held galactic civilization together had been destroyed. When oppressed populations realized they could choose freedom, when conditioned minds remembered what it felt like to think independently, when rigid military hierarchies faced opponents who fought for hope rather than dominance, the old order simply collapsed. 6 months later, Ambassador Carol Bennett stood before the new Galactic Assembly and looked out at representatives from over 300 species. The chamber was chaotic and loud and wonderful, filled with voices that had never been heard before and ideas that had never been considered. "We are here to build something new," she announced, and for the first time in galactic history, no one could predict exactly what that something would look like. In the front row, a young Vorthak officer who had chosen to remove his military conditioning raised his hand with a question. When Carol nodded to him, he did something that would have been impossible just months before. He smiled. It was awkward and uncertain, the smile of someone learning to use facial muscles that had been suppressed for generations. But it was genuine, and it represented hope for a future that no computer could calculate or politician could control. Throughout the chamber, other aliens began attempting their own versions of smiling. Some were more successful than others, but all of them were trying to express something that had been missing from the galaxy for far too long. As Carol watched hundreds of species learning to hope again, she realized that humanity had given the galaxy the most dangerous gift imaginable. They had given it the freedom to become something better than it had ever been before. And somewhere in the back of the chamber, Jake Morrison sat with his crew and smiled the smile that had started it all. It was the smile of someone who had looked at an impossible situation and chosen to make it possible anyway. The galaxy would never be predictable again. And that was exactly the point.